You've seen the photos, grainy old shots from the early 1970s, the kind your dad or granddad kept in old cardboard shoeboxes. A skinny young man with wild, sun-baked hair standing beside a funny car painted in colors loud enough to wake the dead. The kind of car that didn't look fast, it looked alive, angry, almost possessed. And the driver? He wasn't posing like most racers. He wasn't trying to look cool. He was grinning like a man who knew something the rest of the drag strip hadn't figured out yet. His name was Tommy Wildman Dawson. And before drag racing turned into million-dollar haulers, polished sponsor suits, and corporate-approved personalities, there was this chaos-loving Texan who believed racing wasn't a competition, it was a show, a spectacle, something you felt in your chest long before the cars reached half-track. This is the story of the madman who made drag racing unforgettable. Before Jungle Jim brought the flames, before John Force turned funny car racing into television gold, before match racing became a business, Dawson was lighting up dusty outlaw strips with a combination of guts, insanity, and showmanship that the sport had never seen before. And if you stick around, like and subscribe, you'll understand why old-timers still talk about him with that little spark in their eyes, the same one they get when they hear the sound of a big block warming up on a cold morning. Tommy Dawson was born in Amarillo, Texas, in 1944. Back when gas was cheap, music was loud, and high school parking lots were full of Chevys, Fords, and Dodges with more horsepower than common sense. His father was a machinist for the Santa Fe Railroad, and his mother worked the counter at a small diner off Route 66. Tommy grew up between motor oil and chrome, sneaking into his father's workshop after school to touch the tools he wasn't old enough to use. By age 12, he was rebuilding lawnmower engines. By 14, he was racing go-karts that were mostly held together with hope and stolen bolts. And by 16, he had already built his first drag car, a 55 Chevy with a tired small block that he tuned so aggressively the engine sounded like it wanted to escape the engine bay. But the moment that would define him came at Amarillo Dragway in 1961. Tommy wasn't racing that day. He was sitting in the stands, eating a bag of popcorn, when he saw a match race between two local hotshots. They were fast, no doubt, but something bothered him. Nobody looked up. Nobody reacted. Nobody cared until the numbers flashed on the board. And that's when it hit him like a wrench to the forehead. Drag racing wasn't supposed to be quiet or polite or predictable. It was supposed to be loud, ridiculous, wild. It was supposed to make people gasp, cheer, scream, laugh, jump out of their seats. Right there in those dusty bleachers, Tommy Dawson promised himself one thing. If I ever get behind the wheel, people are gonna remember it. Fast forward 3 years. Dawson is 19, broke, working part-time at a local engine shop, sleeping in a tiny garage apartment, and eating more canned beans than any doctor would recommend. But he had something more valuable than money. He had a reputation. People said he could listen to an engine and diagnose it like a surgeon with a stethoscope. They said he tuned carburetors by feel, shifted by instinct, and drove like the devil himself was chasing him. But he wasn't winning attention because he was the fastest. Not yet. He was winning attention because he did things nobody else dared. While most racers eased the throttle, Dawson slammed it like he was trying to break it off. While others lifted when the car drifted sideways, Dawson kept his foot in it, drifting across the lane like a rodeo bull made of metal and gasoline. And people noticed. He wasn't the best, but he was the most exciting. The crowd started chanting, "Wild Man," every time he rolled to the line. Promoters started paying him $20 extra just to show up. And Dawson? He realized something most racers never do. Speed is impressive, but spectacle is unforgettable. By 1965, Tommy had built his first real funny car out of a junkyard Chevy 2, a homemade fiberglass body, and an engine that looked like it belonged in a science museum display labeled "Do Not Touch." It was loud. It was unstable. It tried to kill him at least once a weekend, and it made him a star. Everywhere he went, crowds packed the fences. They weren't there to see perfect runs. They were there to see if the wild man survived the next one. And Tommy? He loved every second of it. Because for him, drag racing wasn't a sport, it was show business on wheels. And America was about to find out just how far he was willing to take it. By the summer of 1966, Tommy Wildman Dawson had become something of a myth in the Texas-Oklahoma racing scene. Not because he was the fastest, there were plenty of guys running better numbers, but because he made every single pass feel like an event, a moment, something worth remembering. You could be standing at the hot dog stand, halfway through a lukewarm Coke, and the second you heard Dawson's engine crackle to life, you'd drop everything, elbow your way through the crowd, and get as close to the fence as your shirt sleeves would allow. Even the seasoned racers, the ones with sponsorship jackets and polished trailers, would stop wrenching, wipe their hands, and mumble, "The damn Wildman staging," as if a thunderstorm was rolling in. Tommy understood something most drivers never grasp until it's too late. People don't talk about lap times, or ET slips, or reaction times. They talk about moments. They talk about the burnout so long it fogged out the concession stands. They talk about the wheel stand that scraped the rear bumper. They talk about the run where everyone swore the car lifted off the ground even though nobody had a camera to prove it. And that's exactly what Tommy began crafting moments. His first real shot at national attention came that same year at an outlaw match race in Tulsa. The organizers didn't want him. They said he wasn't consistent enough, wasn't polished enough, didn't represent the professional image they were trying to build. But the crowd demanded him, literally demanded him. When word spread that the Wildman might not be racing, people started shouting at the promoters, banging on the fences, chanting, "Let him run," until the organizers caved. That night sealed his reputation forever. Tommy rolled his Chevy 2 toward the line, engine popping and growling like a giant dog straining at its chain. And instead of doing the controlled burnout everyone expected, he dumped the clutch, stood on the throttle, and painted a wall of smoke so thick you couldn't see the tree, the starter, or even the car itself. Someone in the stands yelled, "He's gonna blow it up!" But then the smoke cleared, and the wild man wasn't sitting still. He was halfway down the track already, tires screaming, header flames licking sideways in the wind. The run wasn't perfect. Hell, it wasn't even straight, but it was unforgettable, and that's all Tommy ever cared about. Shortly after that, the match race bookings exploded. Promoters across Arkansas, Kansas, Missouri, and Louisiana all wanted a piece of the wild man. Not because he was winning championships, but because he filled stands, packed them, actually. If a track owner saw ticket sales lagging, all he had to do was scribble "Wildman Dawson versus local hero" on the flyer, and boom, the phone would start ringing. Tommy understood this better than anyone. He learned to negotiate appearance fees, not prize money, because he knew promoters weren't paying for victory, they were paying for spectacle. And spectacle is what he delivered every single weekend. By 1967, he wasn't alone anymore. The big names were starting to notice him. Jungle Jim had heard whispers about the Texan kid who drives like he's trying to impress the devil. Gene Snow mentioned him in an interview, calling him reckless but damn entertaining. Even Don Prudhomme, who rarely complimented anyone outside of his tight circle, said, "The kid's got guts. Maybe too much, but guts all the same." And yet, for all the growing buzz, Tommy still worked on his car in a cramped two-bay rental garage behind a laundromat, where the air always smelled like hot oil and dryer sheets. He wasn't corporate. He wasn't polished. He wasn't the future of the sport. He was the raw, unfiltered, gasoline-soaked present, and older fans loved him for it. But what truly pushed Tommy Dawson into the realm of legend happened at the Amarillo Nationals that fall. The event was packed, locals, traveling teams, veterans from all over the Southwest, and everyone knew the headliner. The Wildman returns home. The energy in the air felt different, heavier, like the entire town had shown up to watch their crazy son finally prove something. And Tommy did not disappoint. Before his first qualifying pass, he strutted out of the trailer wearing a bright red bandana, no shirt, and jeans so dirty they looked like they'd been wiped on every engine block in Texas. The crowd roared before he even touched the ignition. He buckled in, fired up the motor, and the sound hit the stands like a sledgehammer, deep, violent, echoing across the empty plains. Then he did something nobody was ready for. Instead of a normal burnout, he drove backwards into the water box, revved the engine, and launched into a burnout in reverse. Smoke everywhere, people screaming, track officials panicking. And when he shifted back into first and blasted forward into a second burnout, so long it erased the starting line rubber, the crowd realized they weren't watching a run, they were watching history. That pass would become one of the most replayed outlaw moments ever captured on grainy film reels. Tommy drifted, bounced, nearly clipped the center line, recovered, and crossed the stripe with a time that wasn't record-breaking, but the reaction was. People climbed fences. Grown men hugged each other. Kids screamed. It wasn't about speed anymore. It was about feeling alive. And that was Tommy Dawson's real gift. He didn't give people numbers. He gave them goosebumps. By early 1960, Tommy Wildman Dawson wasn't just a crowd favorite anymore. He was a touring attraction. Promoters didn't advertise races. They advertised him. Newspaper flyers in tiny Midwestern towns read things like, "The Wildman is coming," or "See the most insane driver in America this Saturday." And the craziest part? Half the people showing up didn't even care who he was racing. They didn't care about the class. They didn't care about the purse. They cared about the moment, his moment. Because when Tommy pulled into the pits, everyone knew there was a chance something unbelievable was about to happen. Traveling back then wasn't glamorous, like today's drag racing haulers. No stacked rigs, no perfect chrome, no air-conditioned lounges. Tommy did it the old-fashioned way. A beat-up flatbed truck, a toolbox with missing drawers, and a trailer held together by welds he did himself at gas stations in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes he slept in the truck, sometimes in the trailer, sometimes on the floor of whatever shop was kind enough to let him fix something overnight. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for favors. He just lived the life the way only an outlaw racer could, fast, rough, and completely unplanned. That lifestyle hardened him, sharpened him, and built a kind of chemistry between him and the people who watched him race. Because fans could sense authenticity. They knew when a racer was corporate polished and when a racer was real. And Tommy was real down to the bone. He'd talk to every kid who approached him, sign anything put in his hands, explain carb tuning to teenagers with wide eyes, joke with old-timers, and shake hands with men who drove 200 miles just to see him run. He didn't see fans as fans, he saw them as part of the show, and they loved him for it. But behind all the laughter and crazy antics, Tommy had a sharp racing brain. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't reckless for the sake of drama. Every wild burnout, every sideways run, every backward maneuver had a purpose. They were calculated expressions of controlled chaos. He used them to build tension, build anticipation, build the kind of emotional energy that kept crowds on their feet. And hidden behind all that showmanship was a secret. Tommy wanted to go big. Not just regional big, national big. He wanted to stand shoulder to shoulder with the heroes of the era. Snow, Prudhomme, Jungle Jim, Nicholson, McEwen. He wanted his name in the magazines, not just in the whispers of local drag strips. That opportunity came, unexpectedly, at a match race in Baton Rouge. A promoter from California, an older guy named Frank Delaney, had traveled down south on business and decided to stop by the track on a whim. He'd never heard of the Wildman. He wasn't expecting much. He just wanted to kill an evening before heading back to Los Angeles. But when he walked into the stands and heard the crowd chanting, he knew something was happening. And when he saw Tommy's entrance, he stopped in his tracks. Tommy didn't walk to his car, he danced toward it, slapping the fender, waving at the crowd, hyping them up like a rock star before the encore. Delaney had been around racing for 30 years, but he'd never seen a driver behave like that. Then came the burnout, longer, louder, wilder than anything Delaney had witnessed, even at Lyons Drag Strip or Fremont. The burnout alone nearly sold him. But then came the run. Tommy launched so hard the front wheels skated across the pavement, drifting just inches from the center line, fighting the wheel the entire pass, and somehow managing to blast through the lights with a time the announcer couldn't even read because he was laughing and shouting at the same time. Delaney stood there, arms crossed, nodding slowly. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't cheering. He was evaluating. Because he had just seen something money couldn't buy. The pure electricity of a natural-born showman. After the race, he found Tommy wiping down his car with a gasoline-soaked rag, still buzzing with adrenaline. "You, Dawson?" Delaney asked. Tommy nodded, suspicious. "You ever think about running California?" Tommy shrugged. "If the money's right," Delaney smirked. "Son, if you run the way I just watched, the money ain't the problem. The crowds will take care of that." 2 weeks later, Tommy Dawson was on the road to the West Coast. What Tommy didn't know, what nobody told him, was that California was the big leagues of entertainment in drag racing. East Coast and Southwest fans loved their drivers, but West Coast fans expected a show. They'd seen everything. They'd watched the early funny cars blow up. They'd watched wheel standers, flamethrowers, stunt acts, jet cars. You couldn't impress them with raw speed alone. But chaos, personality, a madman behind the wheel? That they understood. Tommy's first California booking was at Lyons Drag Strip, the legendary Saturday night cathedral of noise, danger, and talent. The place where reputations were built or destroyed. The announcer introduced him with a chuckle, calling him a cowboy from Texas who thinks tires grow back. But the crowd didn't laugh long. Because when Tommy lit up the water box and created a smoke trail so thick it swallowed the Christmas tree lights, the stands erupted. When he backed up faster than most guys drove forward, people started whistling. And when he launched sideways, crooked, wild, jaws dropping everywhere, the fans lost their minds. After the run, as Tommy coasted back toward the pits, hands shaking from adrenaline, he saw something he hadn't seen before. Jungle Jim himself, standing at the guardrail, arms folded, nodding slowly. That famous sly grin creeping across his face. The wild man had arrived. Tommy had barely stepped out of his car when a swarm of fans rushed the return road. California crowds didn't act like East Coast crowds. They didn't politely clap or nod in approval. They surrounded him, shouting questions, slapping the roof of his car, begging for autographs on hats, shirts, even dollar bills. Tommy looked around, wide-eyed, overwhelmed, but grinning like a kid who just snuck into a circus. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't just that crazy driver from Texas. He was a star, a real one, the kind California noticed. Before he could catch his breath, Jungle Jim walked over, hands on his hips, that long hair blowing in the Saturday night breeze. Everyone backed up, not because they feared Jungle Jim, but because they revered him. He was the Elvis of funny car chaos, a man whose reputation reached further than the smell of nitro in the air. Tommy froze. This was the guy he'd watched in magazines, the guy he'd heard stories about in pit lanes all over America, the guy who turned drag racing into theater long before the NHRA admitted they needed it. Jungle Jim didn't offer a handshake at first. He simply leaned in, looked at the burnout marks Tommy had left behind, and laughed. "Son," he said, "you're either the best thing I've seen in a while, or the dumbest." Tommy wiped sweat from his forehead. "Maybe a little of both?" he said. Jungle Jim smirked. "Good answer." Then he finally extended his hand. "Welcome to the circus." That handshake changed Tommy's life. Because when Jungle Jim took an interest in you, the promoters noticed. The fans noticed. Even NHRA officials noticed. Suddenly, Tommy wasn't just another booking, he was a headliner. Promoters started advertising shows as Jungle Jim versus the Wildman. In some towns, the posters didn't even list other racers. It didn't matter who else showed up. Fans were coming for the chaos. Within weeks, Tommy was running double the dates he'd planned. Lyons Drag Strip booked him again, then Orange County, then Fremont, then Irwindale. then match racetracks in Arizona, Utah, New Mexico. Word spread like wildfire. The wild man was real, and he was just getting warmed up. But fame and drag racing came with a price. The more gigs Tommy booked, the faster he burned through engines. He wasn't gentle with them. He wasn't careful. His crew, really just two buddies from back home, worked like surgeons under pressure, patching blown head gaskets, bent rods, and cracked headers in motel parking lots at 2 a.m. They used flashlights held in their mouths. They borrowed tools from strangers. They bought parts with money they didn't have. Tommy didn't care. He always told them the same thing: as long as it runs by tomorrow night, we're good. Then came the night in Bakersfield, the run that made him national news. The track was packed, wall-to-wall people, grandstands filled an hour before sunset. The announcer hyped him up like a WWE wrestler. "He's wild, he's out of control, he's the man your mama warned you about. Give it up for Tommy, the wild man Dawson." Tommy soaked in the cheers, struck a pose, slapped the roof of his funny car like it was a wild animal he was about to unleash, and fired it up. The burnout. Oh, the burnout. It wasn't just long, it was legendary. Thick smoke covered the entire starting line. The air turned white. Fans leaned forward, squinting through clouds that smelled like hot rubber and nitro. When Tommy reversed, he didn't crawl. He blasted backward, nearly clipping a staging cone, and the entire crowd screamed like they were watching a stunt show. Then he staged shallow, revved high, and launched. The car didn't go straight. It never went straight. It danced, wiggled, and snapped sideways at half-track. But Tommy didn't lift, not even close. He kept his foot buried in it. Flames shot from the headers. The engine screamed like it was begging for mercy. The crowd was losing their minds. And then, in the most insane moment of his entire career, Tommy's car lifted into a wheel stand at almost 170 miles per hour. Front wheels up, rear tires clawing at the pavement, nitro popping. Track workers running for cover. He rode that wheel stand long enough for the announcer to yell, "Oh my God, he's still in it!" When the car finally slammed back down, sparks shot from the chassis, the engine coughed, and Tommy somehow crossed the finish line before the car coasted to a dying stop. Silence. Then the grandstands exploded. People didn't clap, they roared. Fans climbed the fences. Kids stood on benches. Grown men hugged strangers. It wasn't a run. It was a moment. One of those rare, unbelievable flashes of insanity people would talk about for decades. Tommy climbed out, breathing hard, hands shaking, covered in sweat and rubber dust, and raised one fist. That photo, Tommy standing on the door of his funny car, fist raised, the engine steaming, became the most printed image on drag racing bulletin boards across the country. It appeared in local newspapers, in drag racing magazines, and even on garage walls from New Jersey to Oregon. It was the moment the wild man officially became a legend. Jungle Jim saw the photo, laughed, and called Tommy the next morning. "Kid," he said, "you're not just in the circus now, you're the ringmaster." Tommy didn't argue, because deep down, he knew Jungle Jim was right. With fame came chaos, and chaos came fast. By the time summer hit full swing, Tommy's life no longer resembled anything close to normal. He lived out of a duffel bag, slept in cheap motels with neon signs that buzzed louder than the air conditioners, and ate greasy diner food at 1 a.m. with other racers who were too wired to sleep and too broke to complain. That was drag racing in 1970s. Raw, loud, unpolished, and Tommy fit into it like he'd been born for it. Tracks didn't just book him, they fought over him. Promoters called his crew chief nonstop, offering bigger appearance fees, better hotel rooms, and more match race dates. "We need the wild man next Saturday," one promoter begged. "My gate number's tank if he's not here," another said. "Bring him in and let him do that sideways burnout thing. The crowd eats it up." Even NHRA executives, who normally pretended match racers didn't exist, started paying attention. They didn't like Tommy. They thought he was too unruly, too unpredictable, too dangerous, but they couldn't deny he was pulling in crowds bigger than some national events. That kind of power made him impossible to ignore. And with all that attention came the sponsors. Suddenly, companies that wouldn't give Tommy a free spark plug were offering him money, parts, even paint jobs. But Tommy didn't want polish. He didn't want some corporate-approved livery. He liked his car loud, bright colors, mismatched panels, hand-painted lettering done in a motel parking lot by a guy who accepted payment in cash or beer. "Looks like a circus wagon," one competitor sneered. Tommy just smiled. "Good," he said. "That's what sells tickets." By mid-season, Tommy had evolved his entire act. He didn't plan it, he wasn't strategic like Jungle Jim, but he had instincts, wild instincts. And fans loved every second. Burnouts got longer. Reverse driving got faster. Sideways launches became his signature. And then came the stunt that cemented his status as the most unpredictable showman in drag racing. It was July, Amarillo Dragway, hot enough that the track surface shimmered like a mirage. Tommy pulled up for first round in front of a crowd that had been sweating all afternoon but refused to leave their seats. People waved hand fans. Kids slurped melting snow cones. Old-timers wiped sweat from their foreheads with folded programs. But when Tommy lit the pre-stage bulb, everyone leaned forward. They knew something wild was coming. Tommy revved the engine to the moon. Flames spit from the headers. His funny car shook like an angry bull ready to buck. Then he launched into the burnout, except this time he didn't stop at the usual halfway mark. He kept going, past the finish line, past the corner where the track tower stood. People in the pits scattered like pigeons. Smoke covered everything. The announcer practically screamed into the microphone, "He's gone off the end of the track, Tommy, where are you?" When the smoke finally cleared, Tommy's car sat perfectly sideways, halfway into the grass, still idling like nothing unusual had happened. It was pure insanity, and the crowd lost their minds. Track operators rushed over, waving their arms, yelling, "What are you doing?" Tommy just grinned through the windshield and revved the engine again, popping the throttle like a drummer tapping cymbals. The fans roared so loudly the tower windows shook. Even the track staff eventually gave up and just laughed. You couldn't control the wild men. You could only hope he'd point the car in the right direction when it was time to race. But while fans adored the chaos, NHRA officials weren't smiling. They were terrified. Tommy broke every unwritten rule of professional racer etiquette. He didn't stand still for interviews. He rarely showed up to meetings. He didn't care about class indexes or safety warnings. He cared about one thing: making the run memorable. And that made him unpredictable in a sport that depended on predictability. Tommy didn't care. He didn't see NHRA as an authority. He saw them as the boring adults at a party telling everyone to quiet down. Meanwhile, he was the guy dancing on the table, pouring beer over his head while everyone cheered. And for a while, that energy fueled him. But deep inside, Tommy knew chaos wasn't free. Engines blew, money vanished, sleep became optional, and the road, those endless two-lane highways between match races, started to wear him down. The long nights behind the wheel, the soreness in his back, the constant smell of nitro embedded in his clothes, the pressure to top himself every weekend. Still, he refused to slow down, because every time he thought about easing off, he remembered what Jungle Jim told him after a race in Denver. "Kid, the day the crowd stops cheering, you're done. Until then, give 'em hell." Tommy took that to heart. Maybe too much. One night, after a brutally long weekend, Tommy sat alone in his motel room. The air conditioning rattled. His racing suit hung over a chair, still smelling like burned rubber. His hands ached. His shoulders throbbed. And for the first time, he wondered how long a man could keep living like this. But the next morning, when the trailer door swung open and the sunlight hit the car, he felt alive again. All the pain, exhaustion, doubt, they evaporated. Because as long as that engine could fire, as long as fans kept screaming, Tommy Dawson was exactly where he belonged. In the arena, making drag racing unforgettable. By the time August rolled around, Tommy wasn't just a fan favorite, he was a force of nature. Everywhere he went, crowds grew thicker, louder, wilder. Kids wore homemade Wildman shirts drawn with Sharpies. Old mechanics argued in the pits about how he kept the car together. Promoters bragged about booking him weeks in advance. And rival racers? They pretended not to care, but they watched him like hawks. Because Tommy did something no other driver could do. He made the entire drag strip feel alive. Even when he wasn't racing, people stayed glued to their seats, waiting to see what he might do next. Maybe another burnout that lasted a quarter mile. Maybe a reverse run that nearly clipped the Christmas tree. Maybe a wheel stand so long people swore physics had taken the day off. With Tommy, you could never predict it. That unpredictability was his magic and his curse. One especially hot weekend in Ohio proved exactly why. The event was packed more spectators than the bleachers could hold. People lined along the fencing, sitting on tailgates, standing on coolers just to get a glimpse of the starting line. Tommy rolled in late, as usual, his hauler coughing and rattling like it was 1 mile away from retirement. Fans ran to the fence shouting his name, "Wildman, show us something crazy!" And Tommy, never one to disappoint, revved the engine twice as he rolled past, shaking the ground like distant thunder. But in the pits, things were tense. The crew had spent hours trying to fix a misfire that kept coming back. The car was running rich on one side, lean on the other, dangerous, unpredictable. Exactly the kind of thing that could turn a nitro funny car into a rolling grenade. "Tommy, we gotta back it down," his crew chief said. "Something's not right. If you run it like this, you're gonna torch ahead." Tommy wiped sweat from his forehead and stared at the car. The paint was faded from too many burnouts. The body panels shook if you leaned on them. The rear tires were practically begging for mercy. But the crowd outside was chanting now. A rhythm, a roar, a demand. And Tommy, he lived for moments like that. "Just give me one run," he said. "One. We'll figure it out after." They strapped him in. The belts were tight. The helmet clicked. The body lowered. The engine fired angry, uneven, spitting flames from one pipe. The crew exchanged looks that said everything. This car isn't happy. But Tommy? He was smiling. A big, reckless grin that only grew wider as he rolled toward the staging lanes. When he pulled up to the burnout box, the announcer practically exploded over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, the moment you've been waiting for, the Wildman is here!" People screamed, stomped, hit the bleachers with their fists. Tommy revved the engine once, twice. The misfire popped and cracked like gunfire. Then he mashed the throttle. The tires erupted in smoke instantly. So much smoke, the starting line disappeared. The crowd disappeared. Even the sun seemed to vanish behind a wall of burning rubber. Tommy kept going and going. Way too long. The engine screamed unevenly, raspy, furious, like it was fighting itself to stay alive. When he finally lifted, the smoke drifted across the entire strip, blanketing the track like a fog rolling in from hell. The starter waved frantically, trying to clear the air, but Tommy wasn't watching the starter. He was watching the crowd. Their reaction was electric. Thousands of people on their feet, cheering, screaming, whistling, and that's all Tommy needed. He staged immediately. No hesitation, no fear, and absolutely no awareness that the car under him was one heartbeat away from catastrophe. The lights dropped. Tommy launched. Hard. So hard the front tires left the pavement, just for a moment. Just long enough for the crowd to gasp. But halfway down the track, boom! A flash of flame burst from the passenger side header. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then another explosion. Boom! This one louder, violent, shaking the grandstands. Tommy felt the car wobble. He lifted instantly. The car swayed left, then right, then straightened as the flames died out. The entire track went silent. The announcer stopped talking mid-sentence. All you could hear was the ticking of a wounded engine and the sound of Tommy coasting to a stop. For a second, nobody knew what they were looking at. Smoke drifted from the hood. The body panel on the right side bubbled from heat. Crew members sprinted down the strip, fear written all over their faces. Even the other racers, normally stone-faced and competitive, stood frozen. Then, slowly, Tommy pushed open the door from inside the smoky cockpit. He climbed out, pulled off his helmet, and raised his hands like a victorious boxer. The crowd erupted, a wall of sound. Relief mixed with celebration. He was alive. Not only alive, smiling, shaking his head like the whole thing was hilarious. Later, when the car was towed back to the pits and the crew opened the engine bay, they found a scorched cylinder head, 2 melted spark plugs, and a cracked header pipe. A lesser engine would have blown itself apart, but Tommy had somehow ridden the edge without falling over it. As usual, his crew chief grabbed him by the shoulders. "Tommy, you can't keep doing this. The car isn't invincible. You aren't invincible." Tommy just grinned. "Doesn't have to be invincible," he said. "Just has to make the crowd scream." And he meant it. Because, for Tommy, drag racing wasn't a sport. It was a performance. A stage. A circus. A battlefield. And as long as the spectators kept showing up hungry for a spectacle, he was going to feed them something they'd never forget, even if it meant dancing on the edge of disaster every single night. Tommy's explosion run in Ohio should have scared him. It should have slowed him down, humbled him, maybe even pushed him into fixing the car properly before running it again. But that wasn't how Tommy's mind worked. If anything, it did the opposite. Because while the crew stood around the melted spark plugs like coroners examining evidence, Tommy sat on a folding chair, wiping sweat from his face and laughing like he'd just pulled the greatest prank of his life. "Boys," he said, pointing at the scorched header, "that right there is how you get a promoter to call you back next week." And sure enough, before they even finished tearing the engine apart that night, 3 different track owners had called, begging to book him for the next event. Tommy didn't run a race team, he ran a wildfire. But that kind of demand came with a price. The schedule grew insane. One weekend they were in Indiana, 3 days later, Tennessee, then back north to New York, then Virginia, then Wisconsin. The crew joked that Tommy probably didn't know what state he was in half the time. They weren't wrong. He'd wake up in a motel room, stare at the wallpaper, and say, "What track are we doing today?" The travel was brutal. Rainstorms, blown trailer tires, nights spent fixing engines under gas station lights. But wherever Tommy went, crowds followed. Fathers lifted their kids onto their shoulders just to see him roll past. Old-timers in lawn chairs nodded in approval. Teenagers held up handmade signs with "Wildman" scribbled across cardboard. Tommy wasn't just a racer anymore. He was a traveling myth. But success brings enemies. And in drag racing, those enemies rarely keep quiet. The first wave of backlash came from other drivers. Not because Tommy beat them. Truth was, Tommy wasn't the fastest guy on the strip. Not even close. He didn't dominate ET boards. He didn't chase records. What he did do was steal the spotlight from everyone else. No matter who won the event, people walked to their cars talking about Tommy. One veteran racer snapped after a race and shouted in the pits loud enough for half the track to hear, "I'm out here running consistent 7s, and that clown gets the biggest crowd because he drives backward like an idiot?" Tommy just shrugged, walked past him, and said, "Maybe drive backward too. Worked for me." The crew had to pull him away before fists flew. The second wave came from the officials. Track managers loved Tommy because he filled seats. Tech inspectors hated him because he broke every unspoken rule of sanity they had. On more than one occasion, an NHRA rep would watch Tommy do a burnout, stretching half the length of the track, and mutter, "We gotta ban that." But then the promoter would lean over and whisper, "If he leaves, half the crowd leaves. Don't even think about it." Tommy existed in a strange world where rules bent around him not because he demanded it, but because the sport couldn't afford to lose him. But the third wave, the one that actually worried the crew, came from the car itself. The funny car was built on passion, duct tape, late nights, and parts bought secondhand from teams with real budgets. Every run put more stress on it than it was ever designed to handle. The frame flexed, the body panels cracked, the blower belt squealed like a tortured animal, every time Tommy revved past 7,000 revolutions per minute. After one event in Maryland, the crew found a hairline crack in the chassis near the steering box. "Tommy," the crew chief said, "we need to park it. This is dangerous." Tommy stared at the crack, took a sip of a warm Coke, and said, "Then weld it. We race tomorrow." It was insane. But they did it, because you couldn't tell Tommy no. You could only try to keep the wheels from falling off around him. And then something else happened, something even Tommy didn't expect. At an event in Kentucky, a promoter approached the crew with a proposal. "We want Tommy to close the night," he said. Final act. Lights down. Full show. No competition. Just him. That had never been offered to any racer before. Drag strips didn't work like rock concerts. Racers ran when they were scheduled, not when the lights were dimmed and the crowd was primed like a theater audience. But Tommy loved the idea immediately. "You want a show? I'll give you a show they'll talk about for years." And oh, he did. The sun had set. The PA system shut off the music. The announcer stepped back. The lights dimmed until only the burnout box was lit like a stage. The crowd went silent. Then Tommy rolled out, the car glowing faintly under the lights, like a creature emerging from darkness. He revved once. The engine bellowed. Then he revved again, louder, angrier. And the crowd leaned forward, waiting. He dropped the hammer. The burnout wasn't just long, it was absurd. Smoke swallowed the car completely. Flames spit from the pipes. The sound rattled the aluminum stands. Grown men covered their ears. Kids screamed with delight. When Tommy emerged from the smoke, he didn't stop. He flicked the shifter into reverse and blasted backward down the track at nearly 80 miles per hour. Even the crew didn't know he was planning that. The crowd lost their minds. People jumped, cheered, hugged each other like they'd just witnessed a miracle. Then he staged, launched, and rocketed into the darkness like a shot fired into the night sky. That run went down as one of the greatest fan moments in 1,970 seconds drag racing history. But after the run, as the crew checked the car, they found something terrifying. A section of the chassis, one they thought they had repaired, had cracked again. Not just cracked, spread, widened, barely holding. That run should have killed him, and Tommy never even realized it. The crew chief didn't sleep that night, because for the first time since joining Tommy's circus, he understood something frightening. Tommy wasn't just pushing the limits of a race car, he was pushing the limits of fate. And one day, fate was going to push back. Tommy Dawson's story doesn't end in a neat little bow, the way Hollywood likes to pretend racing legends ride off into the sunset. That was never who he was. Tommy didn't come to drag racing to collect trophies or polish corporate plaques. He came to wake the sport up, to jolt it, to make it breathe fire and shake the bleachers and remind every man, woman, and kid in America why they fell in love with horsepower in the first place. And that's exactly what he did. Long after the engines cooled and the crowds went home, long after the posters faded and the match race money dried up, the legend of the wild man lived on in every burnout that stretched too long, every wheel stand held just a little too high, every driver who understood that the fans in the stands deserved something unforgettable. Ask any old-timer who was there, anyone who smelled the nitro, felt the rumble in their chest, watched the smoke clear under those buzzing floodlights, and they'll tell you the same thing. Drag racing before Tommy and drag racing after Tommy were two completely different worlds. He didn't survive on luck. He didn't survive on sponsorships. He survived on heart and nerve, and the belief that racing wasn't meant to be pretty or safe or predictable. It was meant to make you feel alive. And that's why we still tell his story. Because even now, when modern racing is polished, sanitized, corporate controlled, there's a part of every fan that misses the chaos, the grit, the danger, the raw thrill of drivers like Tommy Dawson. So if you want more stories like this, more legends, more forgotten heroes, more wild moments from the golden age of American horsepower, hit that like button, subscribe, and stick with us. The past is full of fire, and we're just getting started.